Welcome to today's webinar. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items so you will know how to participate in today's event. You will have the opportunity to submit text questions to today's presenter anytime by typing your questions into the Q&A box, which is located to the left of the side of your screen. You can also use the same Q&A box for assistance in case you encounter any technical issues in viewing or listening to the webcast content. You can also interact with the presenter and other attendees via group chat, which is the comic bubble option beside the question mark, down at the bottom menu. Please make sure you have this window open for the entire duration, as there will be several instances that the speaker may interact with you every now and then. Lastly, you can open and download each of the documents available for you in the resource list window located at the bottom left of your screen. Please note today's webinar is being recorded and will be available an hour after the live session by using the same link to join this webinar. I'd now like to hand it over to our presenter today, Kinsella. Thank you. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Gavin, and welcome everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are. How exciting is it to finally be talking about the CELF P3 Australian and New Zealand Standardised Edition. So the great news is it's almost here. And we can certainly pre-order and pre-purchase the print copy complete kit in the meantime, but it really is only officially being released/published in September, but we'll talk through that as the webinar progresses. But lovely to have everyone here, so welcome. Let's look at what we hope to achieve, what I hope we will all achieve by the end of the webinar. I think I skipped a slide. Before I get into that, just a quick reminder, I'm going to spend most of the time looking at the new subtests and then, of course, subtest administration and scoring. A little bit of time on the test development and research for those of us who are interested in that. And, of course, I'll continue to unpack that as the training progresses. And we'll talk about what our training options will be before the release, the official release or publication date. And then, of course, there'll be time for questions and answers. So what I hope we'll achieve by the end of today's session, we'll all be able to describe at least two differences between the P2 and the P3. We will be able to explain how to obtain and score the connected speech sample using the Note Juice book. And hopefully we can list at least two subtests that comprise the Academic Readiness Index and the Early Literacy Index scores. So what is the CELF P3? It will officially be released in September, and like its predecessors, it's an individually administered norm-referenced instrument, like the P2, that can be used to assess the language and communication skills in our littlies, our 3 to 6 year olds. Now, the P3 is a download extension of the CELF 5, which was first published in 2017, as we know. It is a practical and efficient clinical tool for identifying, diagnosing, but more importantly, it really is a tool to help us as clinicians to plan those intervention strategies. Because what's the point of assessing if we're not going to actually provide targeted intervention so we can help these little people perform the best that they can in their schooling years? But also we want to be able to use the scores as follow-up evaluation. So how do we do that? And I'll talk more about that as the webinar progresses. Because, as I've said, we really want to be able to help these little people who are at risk or do have communication difficulties in those preschool years. The P3 subtests do parallel the CELF 5 subtests, and to increase the ceiling of the P3 and to facilitate score consistency at the 5 and 6 year old years, those two ages which are shared by the tests, the P3 and the CELF 5 do share some test items, so you'll notice that. What are the applications of the CELF P3? Well, we know it can be used to determine if a child has a language difficulty or disorder, and once this has been determined that they do in fact have a difficulty, any of the following paths can be followed. Not sure if you can see me pointing on the screen. Using the P3 in order to evaluate the nature of the impairment, and that's really important. We want to look at the child's strengths and weaknesses. We want to look at those affected language modalities. So is it expressive? Is it receptive? We want to understand the content areas and the conditions that enable the student or the child to communicate more effectively. We really do want to see what's going on in the early classroom and literacy fundamentals, so that's something that's new, and then how they're going with their communication in context. The CELF P3 includes revised subtests from the previous editions and new subtests, and we're going to look at vocabulary and word relationships, so of course a focus on semantics, as well as word and sentence structure, so of course our morphology and syntax. We're also going to look at the rules of oral language used in responding to and conveying messages. So even though with a P2 we did have some information about that, we've now got standard or scaled scores, and we'll talk through those. Additionally, we've got the standardized norm-based measures of emerging literacy and pragmatic skills to help us as clinicians to compare the little person that we're working with to their typically developing peers in their classroom or their preschool. To better reflect current diagnostic and assessment practices in the various settings, the P3 offers a revised assessment process compared to the P2, but the revised assessment process does continue to give us as clinicians flexibility in selecting and administering only those subtests and checklists relative to the specific objectives of what the student's needs are. However, even though that's documented and published and recommended by, it's not recommended, it's a suggestion by the authors. As you know, my recommendation to us as clinicians is, since we have access to the gold standard assessment, being the P3, we've made the effort not only to purchase it, but to attend training, to learn, to understand it, not only the administration procedures, but also to try and get our head around the interpretation and the results. Plus, we've got the parent and the student in front of us. It really does make sense to try and administer the test in its entirety. Because as you know, once you start looking at discrepancy analysis and digging a little bit deeper, you really do get an interesting and a deeper insight into what's going on with a student. Okay, looking at the new subtests. We've got 2 new subtests. They can be used independently, and they're not required to obtain those index scores. And we'll talk about when we might start thinking about using those. The connected speech sample has got increased diagnostic support and was designed to further evaluate language skills in the context of a language sample. So that's pretty neat. And the Pragmatics activity checklist assesses communication in context. For those of you who use the CELF 5, it's very similar to that. And this was designed to assess social language skills that may interfere with a child's interactions and performance in various settings, mainly within the classroom, but we also want to start looking at what's going on in the playground and, of course, at home. The P3 offers 3 additional subtests that now yield scaled scores. Yay! So we've got scaled scores for our phonological awareness, our pre-literacy rating scale, as well as our descriptive pragmatics profile. And of course, having these standard scores allows us as clinicians to easily compare how our little guy in front of us or little girl in front of us is doing compared to the rest of their classmates or their preschool mates. The P3 has new index scores, which is really interesting. So the first one is the Academic Language Readiness Index, and the second one is the Early Literacy Index. And this is going to help us enhance the test's clinical utility. So a little bit more about each of these. The Academic Language Readiness Index is a composite score, and it can be obtained for students from 3 to 6. It consists of our expressive vocab, following directions, and descriptive pragmatics profile subtests. These curriculum-relevant assessment measures can be used to describe the language and the socialization skills needed in the classroom. Now, we know those children who have poor language and socialization skills are going to struggle, and they really do need direct support and modifications put in place. But those children who only have poor language skills but okay or adequate socialization skills really only need that direct language intervention. But they do need some support around the academics as well. And children who have adequate language skills but poor socialization skills They may do well academically, but they do still require those direct services and accommodations to help foster and encourage the positive social interactions with their peers. Now, the Academic Language Readiness Index score can help to make recommendations for the classroom setting and help us who are working in the multidisciplinary teams design appropriate instruction together with the results of the behavioural observation checklist. And I will talk more about that in a follow-up webinar series. For those of you who are very familiar with the P2, I've always recommended that we do take into consideration the behavioural observations from the student or during the assessment. And we do have that printed on the P2 record form. And it's really particularly important now with these changes in the P3 to really consider those, because it gives us amazing additional qualitative information, and we can use the information from the standardized part of the assessment together with our behavioural observations to really facilitate the child's intervention planning and work closely with the rest of the team who's supporting the child. Looking at the early literacy index, now just a reminder, that's the phonological awareness and the pre-literacy rating scales subtests were designed to provide an organised observation of the child's early literacy skills, because we get the standard score for each of those now, and that feeds into the composite score. So when interpreting the results from this index score, we're going to evaluate the potential impact of the child's early literacy and or preschool experiences on these test results. And as we know as clinicians, phonological awareness and pre-literacy development are really critical components to the student's future literacy success. So it's pretty neat that we've standardized that and that's now available for us. What else have we done and updated? So compared to the P2, the P3 discontinue rules have been reduced or retained to minimise that formal testing time. And I'll talk about testing time a little bit later on as well. The P2 STEM books have been reformatted and repurposed. The P3 only includes the one stimulus book now, and all the verbal and visual stimuli that you need for administration directions are included in the actual stimulus book. There are some exceptions, but generally everything you need to do and say is in the STEM book. Like the P2, the P3 includes a no juice book that is used for the connected speech sample subtest. Now, this no juice story has been repurposed as a story retell task for connected speech subtest instead of the recording sentences task in the P2. We got a lot of clinician feedback around that, so that's how these changes have come about. So we do value your feedback, and the clinicians across Australia and New Zealand are very good at giving us feedback. So thank you. Keep that coming, and we're hoping that you love the improvements. I've already said this, but just a reminder, we've got better floors and or ceilings. We've expanded the floor of the test to provide greater diagnostic value for our littlies in this cohort, so our 3 to 4 year olds. But we've also expanded the ceiling to provide greater diagnostic value for the students aged 5 and 6. The biggest thing for me, well, let me rephrase that. The most exciting thing for me about having the P3 coming out is the updated norms. We know the norms from the P2 were collected long ago now, so it's nice to have those new updated norms, but also we will have our digital options. So the usual, as with our CELF 5, we'll have it available on Q Interactive, Q Global and via CoView as an add-on. Those will only be available in September though. And exciting new addition to the CELF family is the CELF Preschool screening test. That's also coming in September. So Yara, I've got a little slide for you to summarise exactly what our options are. What is available now is the print complete kit. You can pre-purchase that now, but remember, folks, we'll take your money, you'll pay for it now, but you'll only get it in September. And the reason we've done that, because a lot of individual clinicians and the bigger organisations have asked if they could take advantage of this year's financial budget. So that's why that's available. Just briefly, it's the usual traditional print manual, stimulus books, and the paper record forms. Scoring is either manual or via Q Global. And the digital options that are coming later this year are, again, the usual Q Global. Remember, you need your digital manual and the stimulus book, and you can use that on any web-enabled device, computer, tablet, MacBook Air, laptop, whatever works for you, but you do need the hard paper record forms. And again, scoring is manual via Q Global. The iPad administration or Q Interactive, so this will be new and exciting for us, like with the CELF 5, it's the integrated digital test administration. All scoring or reporting is included. And then, of course, those of you who use the CELF 5 via CoView, the CELF P3 will also become available. Remembering, though, that you'll either need access to your digital or print examiner's manual and the hard paper record forms. The P3 offers 10 norm reference subtests that are going to give us our scaled scores. And then there's 2 supplementary subtests that will give us criterion scores. More about that in a moment. But these are the subtests that give us our scaled scores. There are a few changes in the subtest names, as with the CELF 5. So now sentence structure is called sentence comprehension. And concepts and following directions is now just simply called following directions. So the P3 is an important part of that complete assessment process, as we know with our CELF 5, and we want to collect as much evidence about the child's communication skills in as many contexts as possible. So the CELF P3 will continue to provide that real clean clinical diagnosis in terms of the student's receptive and expressive modalities, as well as their language content and structure. But now we've got more information from the P3 on the students' emerging literacy skills as well as their pragmatic skills. Okay, and of course we've got the usual standardized scores in terms of our standard scores, our composite scores, but we've added gross scale values to help measure the students' progress over time. So as with our CELF P2 and CELF 5, the 10 norm reference subtests are grouped based on similar assessment measures to yield our composite scores. The different combinations, as you can see by the shaded and unshaded areas, will feed into the different composite scores. So the different combinations of the 7 subtests retained from the P2 will give us our core language score, the receptive language index, expressive language index, as well as language structure and our language content score. And the 2 of the 7 subtests will feed, along with the descriptive pragmatics profile, will feed into our academic language readiness index, as well as our early literacy index. So that's pretty exciting. Let me know what you think about those changes. You can chat me anytime. The CELF P3 subtests that are included in the P3 have been broadened in scope, and we've got easier as well as more difficult items to adequately cover the range of developmental skills. And you'll see what I mean about that in a moment. A quick mention about administration time. We get lots of questions about how long does it take. Generally, those 3 subtests that feed into the core language score, which is sentence comprehension, word structure, and expressive vocabulary, takes about 20 minutes. The range there is 15 to 20 minutes, but certainly let's give it 20 minutes, depending on the child's age and responsiveness. Now, it's really tricky to answer how long does the test actually take, and you understand this yourselves from your own experience. And it really does depend on which subtest we're administering, how old the student is, what their language ability is like, how engaged they are, etc., etc. So it's tricky to give an exact time, but we want to leave as much time as is necessary to capture as much about the student's language as possible. So we don't want to rush the assessment, but we don't want to take forever either. So I always say your initial assessment, block out at least an hour and a half, and it's okay if you don't use it, but then you're not rushing That's just a guide. Let's look at the subtests in a little bit more detail now. So with sentence comprehension, and most of you are more than familiar with this, but for the newbies in the room, we'll go through this. For the sentence comprehension, the child identifies a picture that matches the sentence that we read aloud as the examiner, and the subtest again has improved floor and ceiling. So sorry if I keep saying that, but I don't want to miss any information. To present the items, the examiner uses the stimulus book as per usual, and we show the picture stimuli, and we record the students' responses on the record form. And the instructions presented to the child are, let's look at these pictures. I'm going to point to a picture that shows I can wear this. Not sure if you can see me pointing, but I am pointing to the shirt. Now you point to the picture that shows I can eat this. Okay, and then hopefully they point to the apple. Right, so what does it measure? Like with the P2 and a CELF5 and all the other speech language assessments that we use, we do have the item analysis. Now this is printed on our record form, as with a P2, and we can see that the sentence comprehension subtest measures language structure, and it's a receptive measure, of course, and the item analysis provides information on the type of skill with which a child is struggling. So this is pretty neat, because when you circle the incorrect items, you then start getting a basis for your intervention planning and programming. So from the item analysis table senior, the subtest provides information on different parts of language structure, including adjectives, prepositional phrases, relative clauses, and subordinate clauses, as we know. For the word structure subtest, the child completes a sentence in a closed procedure with the targeted structures. And again, we've got improved floor and ceilings. The administration directions were added for demonstration items. You can see there, I've highlighted it with the big blue arrows between the test items in the word structure subtest to improve a child's understanding of the expectations of the task. So we did notice, and also from your feedback, that from the P2, sometimes the student didn't actually know what was expected of him or her. So we've added those extra demo items just to make sure they know exactly what we want from them. Here is an example of the subtest items. I'm going to show you some pictures and say some things about them. I want you to help me by finishing some of the things I say. I'll do the first one. Listen. Here is a boy, and here, obviously we want them to finish it, is a girl. And then you score it appropriately and you go on to the trial items. This subtest measures language structure and the expressive part of that, and the item analysis indicates the subtest provides information on different grammatical structures, including prepositions, possessive nouns, verb tenses, pronouns, etc. So again, pretty nice and useful to have the item analysis as we go. And you'll notice it's color-coded to match the items. So we match the items on the record form, so we're not losing track of where we're at. Because often when we're scoring, we're focusing on the student rather than on our scores and what we think the response should be. So it's really useful to have this color coding to help guide that administration process to keep it nice and streamlined, so we can really focus on the student rather than being stuck in our own head and our own scoring. Expressive vocabulary, it's very similar to the P2. There have been some changes, but the biggest changes you will be very excited about. Calculator, telephone, and newspaper have been removed. I can hear you all going, oh, thank goodness, finally. So, of course, the child names an object, person, or activity, as shown in the picture, and the expressive vocabulary subtest feeds into the new academic language readiness index, together with the following directions and Pragmatics profile subtests. The example item is, look at this picture. This is a bird. Look at this picture. What is this? Okay? So either pointing or naming. And then again, the analysis of the child's responses provides that initial description of the child's expressive vocabulary and where they're at. And we want to use the item analysis as per usual to start determining error patterns in the child's responses. Following directions, again, a reminder, this contributes to the new Academic Language Readiness Index along with Expressive Vocab and the Pragmatics Profile subtests. It includes a new task of following directions by pointing to body parts. All right, so this is developmentally easier task, which improved the floor of the subtest, allowing children with those emerging skills to participate, so our younger little ones. The older students, the 5 and 6-year-olds, when I say older students within this cohort, right, they will start at a later point, and they are going to point to the usual animals as with the CELF P2. Now, folks, a reminder with the familiarization items, if a student is unable to point to or name body parts or animals for the 5, 6-year-olds, we don't do the subtest, okay? I get lots of questions around that. So if they can't pass, in inverted commas, the familiarization items, we just cease testing. This is an example item. Look at these pictures. There are big animals and little animals. Point to the little cat. Go. Okay, so very similar. Again, item analysis. This is really useful because we want to start looking at the level of complexity of instruction that the child is able to understand. And again, we're going to see some error patterns emerging. So we can focus on really specific intervention training, targeted planning and training. Recalling sentences, still there, still one of my favourite subtests. It evaluates the child's ability to listen to spoken sentences, and of course these get more difficult and get longer and longer. And the student has to repeat the sentences without changing morphology, syntax or meaning, so that's really important. And as with a P2, you say, I'm going to say something. I want you to listen carefully and say exactly what I say. Let's try one. The dog is eating. And again, we have an item analysis. And what we want to look here is it gives us an initial idea of the language content and the sentence structures that the child has internalized and is able to use. And in the later webinar series, we'll really be unpacking why it is so important to see something like a sentence repetition task on a measure of oral language. So watch the space. So again, circling the incorrect versus correct items. Well, no, we don't circle the correct items. We circle the incorrect items, and we start watching those trends emerge and see if those trends are consistent across the subtests, or if they do in fact have a specific weakness in one area versus another, which is more often than not the case. Basic concepts, again, still there, still really useful. Change some of the demo items. And as usual, the child points to a picture that illustrates the targeted concept presented by us as the clinician. Now, the revised items in both the basic concepts and the following directions provide separate assessment of semantic concepts and following directions. So what this does is it allows more precise assessment and analysis of the target concepts in both measures. Again, based on clinician feedback, we were like, well, is it that they can't actually follow the directions, or they don't actually understand the basic concepts? Therefore, because they don't understand the concept, they can't follow the directions. Anyway, here is a demo item. Again, hopefully you can see me pointing. So we look at these children, and it does prompt us to point to each picture as you talk about it. This is a baby. The baby is little. This is a girl. She is big. And this is a boy. He is big too. Look at the children again. I'm going to point to the one who is little, and then it prompts you to say it, not to say, but to point to the picture of the baby and say, the baby is little. And then, of course, you go on to the trial items. And again, the analysis of the child's responses helps us to determine exactly those basic concepts that the student has mastered versus those which they haven't, which again is really useful because, again, as I said initially or previously, it got a bit muddled with basic concepts and following directions. So is it the concept they not understanding, or do they in fact just, not have the ability to attend, to process what you're saying and follow those oral instructions? Word classes, so very similar. The child will choose 2 words or pictures that are related from a choice of 3 or 4 words or pictures, depending on how old they are. And again, like with the CELF 5, we have dropped the expressive section of the child. This has been repurposed to an extension testing procedure like with the CELF 5. And I'll touch on it a little bit, but again, in the ongoing webinar series, we'll go into more detail and provide some tips and tricks, not tricks, some tips as to how to use this extension testing. Here's an example item. The clinician will say, I'm going to say some words and show you some pictures. 2 of the words go together. Look and listen as I say the words. And again, remembering, folks, you're pointing to each picture as you name them. That's really important. Even though it is a prompt in the record form, some administrations I've watched, clinicians tend to drop the pointing. But just a reminder, it's important to follow the administration directions to a T. So we've got bread, shoe, and apple. And it's saying bread, point, it's prompting us to point in case you can't see me pointing, and apple are the 2 words that go together best. And then we go on to the trial item. So 2 of these words go together. Look and listen carefully to the words I say and tell me the 2 words that go together best. Cat, lamp, dog. And again, we have an item analysis. And yeah, we're going to start looking at the semantic categories, which is really important and really interesting. And of course, we're going to make decisions, clinical decisions, intervention decisions, based on the child's age, their developmental expectations, their experiences, and their culture. So taking all the item analysis into account is really useful. Before I forget to say, for those of you who use Q Global or will be using Q Global, the item analysis happens automatically. But, well, no, that's not true. You have to input the data for it to happen automatically. But if you're using Q Global, just be mindful that that item analysis does actually generate as well. So yeah, we've got a little bit of information and an intro into extension testing. My recommendation, and the reason I've popped it in today is because I do get a lot of questions around, well, when do we use extension testing? Is it during the actual assessment or is it after? So the recommendation is you complete your testing, your standardized procedures as per usual. And then once you've done all that, you come back and then do the extension testing, right? And why do we want to do that? Well, we want to consider extension testing to learn more about the factors that may have contributed to the child's errors. So what I mean by that, the errors may result from task or format novelty, task complexity, the length or the complexity of the instructions, the content of the items, or the types of response required. So by us going back after the initial complete assessment, so once we've followed the test to the T and done it by the book and followed administration procedures, we then go back and systematically vary the test content, directions and responses required. And then from there, we're going to determine where and when the child's ability to respond correctly begins to break down. So then you can start saying, okay, so in effect, we're going to use the extension testing to establish conditions under which the child can perform successfully. And these results allow for making judgments about the degree of difference between the conditions under which the child performs the skill well compared to how they're doing in the classroom. And again, folks, I know the manual's not out yet, but when you get to the manual, we have put in extensive suggested activities for extension subtests. For each of the subtests, actually, not only for word classes. Word classes is interesting because we've dropped the expressive component. So we do give you some indications and some tips on how to use the expressive component for extension testing. And of course, we've done the same in the CELF 5. I think I lost audio. I'll just go back and repeat that. My audio dropped out. I've already introduced us to the Academic Language Readiness Index. So from the slide in front of you, you can see which subtests feed into that language index score. Now, this group of subtests captures abilities by two things, our language domain and by our language modality. What I mean by that is language domain, we're going to be able to pull out content. So what's the child's vocab like? What's the actual language content like? And we get that from the expressive vocabulary score. We're going to be able to look at their form from the following directions and the use of their language from their descriptive pragmatics profile. And also we're going to understand how well they use their language modality. By that I mean, is it receptive or expressive? So which modality is more affected? Is it the expressive skills or their receptive skills? And we use this information to provide a description of the language and socialization skills that the student needs in that classroom. Descriptive pragmatics profile now has scaled scores, which is really exciting. Also, just as a side, we have, for those of you using the print version, it comes as a tear of pad, and there are extra forms available in the tear of pad if you want information from multiple respondents. And so if you want to ask a couple of the students' teachers or different caregivers for input about the students' pragmatic skills, that's certainly available as extra pages for us in the tear of pad. And again, this feeds into our Academic Language Readiness Index score. I know we know this, but just a reminder, the descriptive pragmatics profile is used to identify the students' nonverbal as well as verbal pragmatic skills that are going to impact their social and academic communication in a context. So classroom learning, on the playground, and how they're going at home. It's really interesting and important to understand those emerging literacy skills. So particularly looking at how the child goes in terms of responding to familiar people in different contexts. Are they able to understand different tone? Like if mom's a bit stern or she gives you a look, can they interpret that really well? The pragmatics activity checklist, this is not dissimilar to the CELF 5 for those of you who use that and are familiar with that and use that often. Again, it's criterion referenced, and we provide this as a checklist of communication behaviours. So what we want to do is we want to observe the child while taking part in these activities throughout the time that they spend with you. And what we want to do is we want to set up those communication scenarios in as authentic a way as possible. So again, for those of you who are familiar with the CELF 5 pragmatics activity checklist, you'll understand exactly what I mean. For those of us who are new to this subtest or to this test, really what we do is we engage the child in 3 activities to complete the checklist. We choose activities from a list of 6 provided in the record form and in the manual. And these pragmatic activities are designed to provide opportunities to observe the child's functional communication skills during authentic conversational interaction. So we set this up as a clinician, right? Now, when preparing to engage the child in these activities, it's really important to note that they shouldn't take longer than 5 minutes, because else it's just going to go on and on and on. And for those of you who've used it or practiced it, we know it can be done. And this is what the authors recommend. So no longer than 3 to 5 minutes, so maximum 5 minutes. When and how do we engage the child? Well, this is really up to you. You'll know the context best. But the recommendation is you can either set these activities up as a rapport building activity, or you can use them as little break activities during your subtest administration, at the end of a few of the subtests, for example, or you can use it as a wrapping up activity. So everything's done or your assessment's done, and you can just set up some of these activities. And that's quite useful to do because all the activities are play-based and game-based. Now, because it's important that we as clinicians are an active participant in each of the pragmatic activities, we recommend, and we strongly recommend, that we're not using the checklist during those activities to check off or mark the student's behaviour. The checklist, for those of you who are familiar with it, no, it's very intuitive. For those of you who are new to this, it is intuitive, so we can read through it, familiarise ourselves with it before the assessment, and then leave it to the side. Then engage in these activities in an authentic way. And once that's done, of course, we take special note of verbal and non-verbal activities or behaviours. And as soon as it's done and you've said goodbye to, I was going to say mum and dad and child, but to the child and the family, then you can go and mark it down. So that's a recommendation. Try not to check it off as we're going through. The Early Literacy Index score, as I've already said, our phonological awareness and our pre-literacy rating scale subtests were designed to provide an organised observation of the child's early literacy skills. So as I've mentioned, it is available in the P2, but this is a little bit more standardised and more organised. Why is it so important? Well, we know that that organised observation of a child's early literacy skills is a measure of school quality or student growth. So we know the impact that this has on the child's ongoing learning. Phonological awareness, folks, yay, we have scaled scores for our students 4, 5 and 6, and this feeds into the Emerging Literacy Index score. As with the previous edition, we've got demos and trials. For compound words, as a quick example, we say to the student, I'm going to say 2 words, listen, pan, cake. I can put these 2 words together to make the word pancake. Now you go. You try it. Put these words together, rain, bow. If the child responds incorrectly, say the words rain and bow come together to make rainbow. And then you go on to the next trials. With syllable blending, the demo is I'm going to say parts of a word very slowly. Kitten. When I put the parts together, I get the word kitten. Then you say to the child, now you try it. Put these parts together to make a word. Pay, pa. If the child responds incorrectly, say the word is paper, and then you go on to present the trials. Our pre-literacy rating scales also has scale scores, and this is really important where we want to look at those child's early emergent reading and writing skills. Things like, how does a child orient a book? Do they hold it upright? Have they got the front cover facing them, or is it upside down facing the other side of the room? And what's the emergent literacy and writing skills like? Are they just scribbling? Are they drawing? Are they starting to resemble some shape, letter shapes? Can they write part, if not all, their name? So these are all interesting things that we want to observe. Certainly was there in the P2, but now we have a scaled score. The connected speech sample. So lots of positive feedback about this one. It's a new subtest and it has criterion scores and descriptive information. So this is a story retell task. What we're going to do is we're going to rate the following. We rate it by story organisation, we're going to be able to recall facts and details, and we're going to look at the grammar and language structures. So yeah, we want to really get a sense of the students' narrative skills. And what we do get is we get this lovely in-depth scoring guide or scoring matrix. So this is on each and every record form, and part of it here is shown on the slide. And it gives us the descriptions of story organization and recalling facts and details. So the overall categories are acceptable. I think you can see it there in the green. Emerging and beginning. So what we do is we circle the description that most accurately describes the child's narrative to provide the qualitative information about the child's overall story and organization, as well as their ability to recall facts and details. Okay. You then complete the connected speech sample analysis by looking at the story grammar and the language structures. And we use this together with our word structure. So again, we're looking at the whole, and we're using subtests in conjunction with each other. With the story grammar scoring table, again on the record form, this is used to score things like title, setting, characters, main idea, events, beginning, middle, and end. And this is pretty neat. I've had a few goes of scoring it. I know some of us in the room collected data, so you'd be familiar with this as well. It's fun. It's fun to score. We circle each component that the child used in their narrative, and you score each story grammar component according to the point values in that scoring table. And then you simply sum the score points to compute the total raw score for each subtest. Folks, I think I lost audio again. My mic seems to be going onto mute for some reason. I might be bumping something. All right, so I think you missed this part. So where do we get the language structure scoring from? So again, within the record form, we use the language structures table, and this includes an adapted list of Brown's grammatical morphemes and other structures to rate the levels of mastery, and you rate it as either acceptable, emerging, or beginning, right? Of course, acceptable use of language structure indicates that the child's use of language structure is at a mastery level, right? Which is 90 to 100% accuracy according to Brown. Emerging use of language structure indicates that the child is in a transitional stage of development and demonstrates at least one correct production. While the beginning use of a language structure indicates that the child has not yet developed the skill and, of course, is unable to apply these rules in a particular situation. Dialectical variations, as with all our standardized assessments, it's really important that we as clinicians are familiar with the child's any dialectal variations either at home or within the community, and then we score their responses accordingly. So we're not going to penalise for any dialectal variations, and these acceptable variations are, of course, printed in an appendix. We think it's Appendix A at the moment, but of course there'll be some tweaks to the manual before it gets to you. We're still in publication phase, reviewing phase, of course. Record form, standard record form, so the raw score for each subtest is adjusted to derive a scaled score, and as with our other tests, the scale scores range from 1 to 19, and they have a mean of 10 and a standard deviation of 3. And the scale scores for several subtests are combined to yield different index scores. And again, our core language score, index score, ranges from 45 to 155, it has the usual mean of 100 and a standard deviation of 15. Two subtests are criterion scored. So that's our connected speech sample subtest. So again, we locate the raw score box for story grammar and record the child's raw score. And based on the child's age and raw score, we circle whether the score is acceptable, emerging, or at the beginning range. Similarly, for Pragmatics activity checklist, again, we locate the total observations box based on the child's age and record the number of total observations. And based on the age and number of observations, we're going to check the appropriate box as to whether they meet or do not meet that criteria. Very briefly about test development, I put lots of information in your notes so that you can go and ponder over it. So I'll just talk very briefly about that, and certainly we'll unpack this in the later webinar series as well, certainly for those of you who are interested. Like I always say, if you need more information and you want to discuss anything, and you are all very good at finding me and sitting down and talking about things in more detail. So, of course, I'm still here for that. So if there are any questions about this part of the presentation that you want some more information about, just reach out, because I'll go through this very briefly, but you have the notes to reflect on. As with all our standardization assessments, we've got the normative sample based on, it's stratified by age, sex, ethnicity, geographic region, parent caregiver education level, and we've matched this to Australian and New Zealand population data as determined by the Census Bureau, right? So for the P3, our normative sample consists of 367 children, and from this table you can see how that was stratified by gender and age. And you can see, hopefully, teeny tiny total column. We had about 50 children in each of those groups. There we've published the students' ethnicity and their ancestry backgrounds, both for Australia and New Zealand. Parent education level, we know this impacts students' language, so it's important that that was represented, and our local sample was stratified according to that, right from parents who hadn't finished high school to those who had higher degrees. Where did our students come from across the countries? Again, census data matched, so most of students came from our bigger states, and most of them were from the urban regions. But of course, we have representation across all states, as well as from the North and South Island in Australia. Reliability of the normative sample, again, lots of information. You know, I like to give you as much information as possible. Won't go through it in detail, but essentially good reliability. Some higher some higher reliability coefficients than others, but generally we've got good reliability. The initial evidence suggests that the CELF P3 is equally reliable for measuring children's language skills, whether the children come from the general population or are children who have in fact been diagnosed with a language difficulty. Clinical validity, so the sensitivity and specificity values indicate that the P3 is a good tool, good for us, for identifying children with possible language impairments. Now, this data might change a little bit because, as I said, folks, our wonderful R&D team is working tirelessly behind the scenes to get this out for us. But generally, these numbers are pretty accurate, but they might change a little teensy bit. But from the data we have at the moment, this table indicates that the cut score of 77, so that's one standard deviation from the mean, results in that best balance between sensitivity and specificity. Using this cut point of 77, we've got a sensitivity of 0.89 or 89% and a specificity of 0.87. So looking good, R&D team, thank you. Correlation with the P2, again, looking really good. Some highs, some lows, some obvious explanations as to why the difference, looking at receptive and expressive modalities. But again, generally everything's as we expect it to be, and we want these correlations to be high. which they are. So typically the composite score, let me move on to these are the correlations for the subtest scores. This is for the composite scores, but typically composite scores are used to make diagnostic and service-related decisions, as we know. So therefore the high correlation, looking at the 0.86 for core language as an example, is a good indication that children's classifications would be similar when taking the P2 and the P3. So that means if a child is identified as having a need on the P2, they would be identified as having the same need on the P3. Does the P3 accurately identify children with language impairment? Yes, it does. This is what our special group study is. So again, we want a large effect size between our typically developing and language disordered children. And this is what this table shows. So effect sizes of between 0.8 and effect sizes of between 0.5 are considered moderate, and those of 0.8 are considered large. So we want to see effect sizes larger than 0.8. So yeah, we can see we've got large effect sizes, almost 2 points, which is good. So the test means that, the information means that the test is able to discriminate accurately between children who are developing language typically versus those who have a language impairment. Okay, folks, I told you there was lots of information, but any questions about any of that, just you know where to find me and we can have a chat offline. So, very briefly, I was hoping there would be time where we could chat each other and you could tell me these answers. But looking at being able to list at least 2 differences between the P2 and the P3. So the main difference is we now have 2 new subtests, the connected speech sample and Pragmatics activity checklist. So I'll just tell you the answers. How can we obtain and score the connected speech sample using the No Juice book? Well, in short, you read the book aloud to the child and you ask them to tell you the story back. You capture the responses and you score it accordingly. And list at least 2 subtests that comprise the Academic Readiness Index and the Early Literacy Index. And I'm very excited about those. That's why I kept presenting about them. So, of course, for Academic Readiness Index, it's obvious we've got expressive vocab, following directions, and the descriptive pragmatics profile that feed into that index score. And what's going to tell us which subtests are going to give us our early literacy index score? Well, we've got phonological awareness and our pre-literacy rating scales. Right, pre-purchase and training options. The print kit is available to order online, so that's $1,050. Remember, folks, you will be charged at point of sale, which means if you buy it today, we'll take your money today, but you'll only get delivery in September once it comes available. We do have a series of mastery training coming up. So what the team and I have planned is by the time that you get the kit in whichever way, shape or form you choose to use it in our hot little hands in September, you'd really be able to open the box or unpack it or, you know, log into your Q Global or Q Interactive account and hit the ground running as it were. And we've tiered this training for you. So tier 1 was today, a real brief, quick overview of what to expect in the P3. And then as we progress through the tiers, we'll get a little bit more in-depth, a little bit more clinical, and we'll culminate in the mastery training, which will be a day and a half, maybe 2 days. We're still working on that. That's coming up in September, where not only will we analyse a tricky case study, but we'll interpret it, make recommendations, and write a therapy plan. Okay, so that's the plan. And that's what's available for you to purchase. At the moment, we have an online special, whereas if you purchase the master training as well as your kit, you can save some money doing that. So watch the space. We're working behind the scenes to get that up and running for you. The offer's there. We just want to make it easy for you to be able to order. So hop online, maybe by tomorrow, if that's something you're interested in. But of course, you can reach out to me and I can help navigate that. The reason we've made this available, as I mentioned previously, lots and lots of you have asked if we can make and take advantage of this year's budget. So that's why we've done this for you. More information, of course, always come to me, and I know you do, and thank you for your ongoing support. Customer support is there as well if I'm unavailable. But as you know, generally I try to get back to you ASAP, so please do reach out to me. Right, folks, we're right on time. At 1:29, I was hoping we'd have more time, but apologies, that was my issue with my audio, where I had to go back and redo some of the slides because you couldn't hear me. But for those of you who can stay on a little bit longer, I'm happy to take some questions. So I've had a few come through here. Let me just open them. I have got Gavin on the line to help me navigate anything I've missed. So let me see. Lots of questions. Thanks, folks. You can keep typing them in the box. For those of you who've got to hop off, I'll make sure that I get back to you. Do you have to do the training is a question that's come up, and I see that's a little bit of a theme. No, folks, no, not at all. And I absolutely acknowledge this. There's so many proficient users of the CELF P2 and early learning and early literacy clinicians in the audience. No, absolutely. If you are happy to pick up the book and run with it, pick up the assessment and do some self-study with the slight differences, of course, no. The training is not mandatory. It was a combination of questions coming certainly from the newer clinicians newer clinicians to the profession, and for those of us who've been in the profession for a while and have moved from working with adults to students, just questions around what support will be available, and that's why we've come up with this mastery training program. But absolutely, it's not essential, it's not mandatory, so up to you if you want to take advantage of it or not. So thanks for asking the question. Is there a date for when the P2 is no longer valid? Oh, thanks for bringing that up. I do get that a lot. So, folks, this is generally how we operate here at Pearson. We will always support an old edition of the test for up to 2 years post-release, the edition of the new test. So what I mean by that is the P3 will publish in September this year. So give yourselves at least 2 years. This is the official stance. Give yourself at least 2 years with a P2 post that. So the P2 theoretically will continue to support until September 2023. However, as I mentioned, I might have said it out loud or maybe it was in my head, the P2 norms are really, really old. And as you've all said, please can you get rid of calculator and telephone, etc. It's really time to transition to the new test as soon as possible. If it's possible, if it's appropriate, may I make the recommendation that clinically we really do need to update, which is why we are pushing the P3 out as early as we can, which is September, because the norms are just too old on the P2. So theoretically, you've got another 2 years post the release in September, but my clinical recommendation is please transition as soon as possible. Hope that helps. If it's not clear, just come back and ask me to say, what did you mean, Angela? Right, let's take a couple more questions and then I'll let you go on with your daily lives. Question, do the electronic versions do item analysis automatically? Thanks, Stephen. I did say the word automatic, and I've got to be careful of saying that because we actually have to input data. I've been able to input the data in the CELF 5 from my record form into Q Global within 7 minutes. All right. And I'm not saying that I'm so good, oh, wow, I can do it in 7 minutes, but all of us are so proficient and we do it all the time. It just highlights that once you get proficient at doing this, it's really quick and easy. My recommendation is if you're inputting data to input all the item scores, and then once that's inputted, you're able to generate your item analysis. So that's what I mean by automatic. So you still have to do the work, but it does generate it for you automatically. And it's quick. So instead of just adding a raw score to your Q global reporting, I recommend that you take the time and add the items, the item scores. And doing that, you can do it in 7 minutes once you're proficient, and it just takes a few goes to get proficient. Then your item analysis is generated. It's such a useful tool. I do have some sample reports of the CELF 5 on the website. So if you can't find them, just reach out to me. I'll send you the links to it to give you an idea of what that looks like. I do recommend you take the extra bit of time because it just gives you that invaluable information. Okay. And last question. This is from Gavin. Is the hard copy of the P2 not digital available now in September? So the hard copy of the CELF P2 is no longer available. The P3 will be available in September, right? The only version of the current version of the test, which is the CELF P2, which is available, is the digital asset via Q Global. So we no longer have the print copy available of the P2. Why? Because we really want you to save your money and buy the P3 in September, if that's okay. If you're desperate for the P2 now, just reach out to me and we'll work out some solutions. I know these questions are so nice. One last question before I let you go. This is from Kelly. Has there been a comparison for individual children across paper-based stimulus and online administration options? Yes, so we've done some equivalency studies. Good question if we've done it specifically for the P3. I'm not sure, I have to find that out, but watch the space. And also watch a website. I'm busy working on some neat little documents and brochures for you to download and little tip sheets. But that's something I can investigate for us as well. But the short answer is we've done equivalency studies based on other tests. So yes, there is that equivalency. All right, folks, thank you so much. I'll hand back to Gavin to close off the presentation. Thank you for persisting with me a little bit longer than usual. And I will make sure I get back to you and answer all those unanswered questions. Thank you for your ongoing support, and I look forward to seeing you soon. Take care, everyone. Over to you, Gavin.
Ladies and gentlemen, this concludes our webcast for today. We hope you found the presentation informative. Have a great rest of the day and stay safe.